Imagine driving 2,000 head of cattle across 1,500 miles of open country. No fences, no roads, just endless prairie, hostile territory, and danger at every turn. Cowboys didn't just herd cattle on these drives. They protected them from threats that could wipe out the entire herd in minutes. These weren't casual trail rides. These were military-style operations where one mistake could cost thousands of dollars and dozens of lives. From stampedes to rustlers, from river crossings to Indian raids, cowboys faced constant threats that required skill, courage, and clever tactics to overcome. The cattle drive era lasted only about 20 years, from the late 1860s to the mid-1880s. But in that short time, cowboys developed protection methods that were brutal, effective, and absolutely necessary for survival. Let's start with the biggest threat every cattle drive faced: stampedes. This was the nightmare that kept trail bosses awake at night. A stampede could kill cowboys, scatter cattle across hundreds of miles, and destroy months of work in minutes. And they could be triggered by almost anything. A clap of thunder, a rattlesnake, a coyote howl, the smell of a campfire, even a cowboy sneezing at the wrong moment could set off a stampede. Cattle are herd animals with a strong flight instinct. When one panics, they all panic. A trail boss's journal from 1871 describes a stampede. Lightning struck near the herd around midnight. Within seconds, 2,000 head of cattle were running blind in the darkness. We lost 3 men that night. 2 were trampled. 1 was thrown from his horse and broke his neck. It took us 4 days to gather the scattered herd. The sound of a stampede was terrifying. Thousands of hooves pounding the ground created a roar like thunder. The ground shook. Dust filled the air so thick you couldn't see. And in the middle of it all, cowboys had to ride alongside the panicked cattle and try to turn them. The protection method was called turning the herd. Cowboys would ride at full gallop alongside the stampeding cattle, firing their guns and shouting to get the lead cattle's attention. The goal was to turn the leaders in a circle, creating a mill where the cattle would run in circles until they exhausted themselves. This was incredibly dangerous. You were riding at full speed in the dark, often in rough terrain, alongside thousands of panicked animals. If your horse stumbled, you'd be trampled to death. If you fell behind, the cattle would run over you. A cowboy's memoir from 1878 describes turning a stampede. I rode harder than I've ever ridden in my life. My horse was foaming at the mouth. I fired my pistol until it was empty, then I just screamed at the cattle. Finally, the leaders started to turn. We got them running in a circle. After about an hour, they slowed down and stopped. I was shaking so hard I could barely dismount. Prevention was better than cure. Cowboys developed several methods to prevent stampedes. They'd sing to the cattle at night. The human voices calmed the herd and let them know cowboys were nearby. They'd avoid sudden movements or loud noises near the herd. And they'd post night guards who would circle the herd constantly, watching for signs of nervousness. A trail cook's notes from 1873 mention the singing. Every night the boys on watch would sing to the cattle. Old hymns, folk songs, whatever they knew. It wasn't about the quality of the singing, it was about the sound of human voices keeping the cattle calm. On quiet nights, you could hear the singing for miles across the prairie. Despite all precautions, stampedes happened regularly. A typical cattle drive might experience 2 or 3 stampedes during the journey. Each one was a crisis that tested the cowboys' skills and courage. While stampedes were accidental, another threat was deliberate and deadly: cattle rustlers. These were thieves who would steal cattle from the herd, either a few at a time or in large groups. Rustlers were a constant threat on every cattle drive. Rustlers operated in several ways. Some would sneak into the herd at night and quietly cut out a few cattle, driving them away before anyone noticed. Others would wait until the herd was crossing a river or moving through rough terrain, then take advantage of the confusion to steal cattle. The most dangerous rustlers were organized gangs who would attack the drive with guns, kill or drive off the cowboys, and take the entire herd. This was essentially armed robbery on a massive scale. A trail boss's report from 1876 describes a rustler attack. We were crossing the Red River when a gang of about 15 men attacked us. They came out of the trees firing rifles. We had no choice but to fight back. Gunfight lasted about 10 minutes. We killed 3 of them and drove the rest off, but we lost 2 of our own men and about 50 head of cattle in the confusion. Protection against rustlers required constant vigilance. Cowboys would post guards around the herd at night, usually in shifts of 2 to 3 hours. These guards would circle the herd continuously, watching for any movement or suspicious activity. The guards were armed, usually with pistols and rifles. If they spotted rustlers, they'd fire warning shots and alert the camp. The other cowboys would grab their weapons and rush to defend the herd. During the day, cowboys would ride in specific positions around the herd. The point riders led the herd. The swing riders controlled the sides. The flank riders kept the middle in line, and the drag riders brought up the rear. This formation allowed cowboys to see the entire herd and spot anyone trying to steal cattle. A cowboy's account from 1879 describes catching rustlers. I was riding drag when I noticed 2 men on horseback watching us from a hill. They weren't doing anything, just watching. I told the trail boss. He sent 3 of us to investigate. When we rode toward them, they took off running. We chased them for about 5 miles before they got away. They were definitely rustlers, scouting the herd for a later attack. Some trail bosses would hire extra armed guards specifically to protect against rustlers. These guards weren't cowboys. They were gunmen whose only job was security. They'd ride ahead of the herd, scout the trail, and watch for potential threats. The punishment for rustling was severe. If rustlers were caught, they were often hanged on the spot without trial. This wasn't legal, but it was frontier justice. Trail bosses couldn't afford to take prisoners or wait for law enforcement that might be hundreds of miles away. A newspaper account from Texas in 1877 describes a hanging. 3 men were caught attempting to steal cattle from a drive passing through the area. The trail boss and his men held a quick trial, found them guilty, and hanged them from a tree. Their bodies were left hanging as a warning to other rustlers. Another major threat to cattle drives was river crossings. Rivers had to be crossed, and every crossing was dangerous. Cattle could drown. Cowboys could be swept away. And the chaos of a crossing made the herd vulnerable to stampedes and rustlers. The challenge was getting cattle to enter the water. Cattle don't like water and will often refuse to cross. Cowboys had to force them in, which required skill and sometimes violence. The method was to get the lead cattle into the water first. Once a few cattle were swimming, the rest would usually follow, but getting those first few in was the hard part. A trail boss's notes from 1872 describe a river crossing. We reached the Brazos River. The water was high and moving fast. The cattle refused to enter. We tried for 2 hours to get them in. Finally, we roped one of the lead steers and dragged him into the water. Once he was swimming, the others followed. The whole herd crossed in about an hour. Cowboys would ride into the water alongside the cattle, guiding them and keeping them moving in the right direction. The current would try to push the cattle downstream, so cowboys had to constantly correct their course. The danger was real. Cattle could panic in the water and start swimming in circles, creating a deadly whirlpool of thrashing animals. Cowboys could be pulled under by the current or trampled by panicked cattle. A cowboy's memoir from 1875 describes a drowning. We were crossing the Arkansas River when one of the boys got pulled under. His horse stumbled and he fell off. The current took him. We searched for hours but never found his body. The river took him. We buried his saddle and said a prayer. Some rivers were so dangerous that trail bosses would scout for days to find the safest crossing point. They'd look for shallow areas with slow current and firm bottoms. A bad crossing could cost dozens of cattle and multiple cowboys, After crossing, cowboys would count the cattle to see how many were lost. It was common to lose 5 to 10 head in a major river crossing. Some crossings were much worse. A trail boss's report from 1,878 mentions losing cattle. Crossed the Canadian River. Lost 23 head. The current was stronger than expected. Several cattle were swept downstream and drowned. We also lost 1 horse. Could have been worse. Another threat that cowboys had to protect against was hostile encounters with Native Americans. This is a sensitive topic with a complicated history, but it was a real concern for cattle drives passing through Indian territory. Most encounters were peaceful. Native Americans would approach the drive and ask for cattle as payment for crossing their land. Trail bosses would usually give them a few head to avoid conflict. This was essentially a toll for using the land. A trail boss's journal from 1873 describes a peaceful encounter. A group of about 20 Comanche warriors approached the herd. Their leader spoke some English. He said we were crossing their hunting grounds and asked for 10 cattle as payment. I gave him 12 to show good faith. They took the cattle and left peacefully. It was worth it to avoid trouble, but some encounters turned violent. There are accounts of Native American groups attacking cattle drives, killing cowboys, and taking cattle. These attacks were often in response to broken treaties, stolen land, or previous violence by white settlers. A newspaper report from 1874 describes an attack. A cattle drive was attacked by a war party in Indian Territory. 3 cowboys were killed, and over 100 head of cattle were taken. The survivors reached Fort Worth and reported the attack to authorities. Protection against potential attacks required careful planning. Trail bosses would avoid areas known to be dangerous. They'd travel in larger groups when possible, combining multiple herds for safety in numbers. And they'd maintain good relations with Native American groups when possible, treating them with respect and paying fair tolls. Cowboys would also maintain a defensive posture when in dangerous territory. They'd keep weapons ready, post extra guards, and be prepared to form a defensive circle if attacked. It's important to note that the vast majority of encounters were peaceful. Native Americans were often more interested in trade than conflict, but the potential for violence was always present, and cowboys had to be prepared. Weather was another constant threat that cowboys had to protect against. Extreme heat, cold, rain, and snow could all kill cattle and cowboys. Weather couldn't be fought, but it could be managed. In extreme heat, cattle would become dehydrated and weak. Cowboys would have to find water sources and give the herd time to drink and rest. They'd travel in the early morning and evening, avoiding the hottest part of the day. A trail boss's notes from 1876 describe heat management. Temperatures over 100 degrees for 5 straight days. The cattle are suffering. We're only moving in the morning and evening. During midday, we find shade and let them rest. We've slowed our pace significantly, but it's necessary to keep them alive. In extreme cold, cattle could freeze to death, especially during blizzards. Cowboys would try to keep the herd moving to generate body heat. They'd look for natural windbreaks like hills or tree lines where the cattle could shelter. A cowboy's account from 1879 describes a blizzard. A spring blizzard hit us in Wyoming. The temperature dropped to below 0. Snow was falling so thick we couldn't see 10 feet. We kept the cattle moving all night to keep them from freezing. By morning, we'd lost about 30 head that had laid down and frozen to death. Rain created different problems. It turned the ground to mud, making travel difficult. It could cause rivers to flood, making crossings impossible. And it could trigger stampedes if accompanied by lightning and thunder. Cowboys would try to find high ground during heavy rain to avoid flooding. They'd wait out severe storms rather than risk moving the herd in dangerous conditions. Disease was another threat that could devastate a herd. Texas fever, also called tick fever, was particularly dangerous. It was spread by ticks and could kill large numbers of cattle quickly. The challenge was that Texas cattle were immune to the disease but carried the ticks. When they traveled north and mixed with northern cattle, the northern cattle would get sick and die. This caused conflicts between Texas drovers and northern ranchers. A trail boss's report from 1877 describes a disease outbreak. About halfway through Kansas, the cattle started getting sick. They had high fevers and were weak. We lost about 50 head over 3 days. The local ranchers were furious, claiming our cattle were spreading disease to their herds. We had to move quickly to avoid conflict. Protection against disease was difficult. Cowboys would try to avoid areas where sick cattle had been reported. They'd inspect the herd daily for signs of illness, and they'd isolate sick animals to prevent the disease from spreading. Some trails were eventually quarantined, with laws prohibiting Texas cattle from entering certain areas during tick season. This forced trail bosses to find new routes or wait until winter when ticks were less active. Predators were another constant threat, though, less serious than stampedes or rustlers. Wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions would attack cattle, especially young calves or weak animals. Cowboys would shoot predators on sight. They'd also keep the herd tight at night, making it harder for predators to isolate individual animals. The presence of cowboys and horses usually kept most predators at a distance. A cowboy's diary from 1874 mentions predators. Heard wolves howling near the herd last night, fired a few shots in their direction to scare them off. This morning we found one calf that had been killed and partially eaten. The wolves got it despite our guards. We'll be extra vigilant tonight. Exhaustion and injury among the cowboys themselves was a threat to the entire operation. If too many cowboys were injured or too tired to work, the herd couldn't be properly protected. Trail bosses had to balance pushing forward with giving men time to rest. They'd rotate duties so that no one was doing the hardest jobs all the time. And they'd carry medical supplies to treat injuries and illnesses. A trail boss's journal from 1875 describes managing exhaustion. The men are worn out. We've been on the trail for 6 weeks with only 1 day of rest. I can see it in their faces and their work. We're camped near a town. I'm giving everyone 2 days off to rest, get cleaned up, and blow off steam. It'll delay us, but we need it. Injuries were common. Cowboys would be thrown from horses, kicked by cattle, or hurt in various accidents. Serious injuries could end a man's career or even kill him. A cowboy's account from 1878 describes an injury. My horse stepped in a prairie dog hole and went down hard. I was thrown and landed on my shoulder, dislocated it. The cook popped it back in, but I couldn't use my right arm for 2 weeks. I had to ride drag one-handed while it healed. The final major threat was simply getting lost. The Great Plains looked the same in every direction. Without landmarks, it was easy to get turned around. Trail bosses used the sun, stars, and known landmarks to navigate. They'd also follow established trails when possible. The Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, and others had been mapped and used by previous drives. Following these trails reduced the risk of getting lost. A trail boss's notes from 1873 describe navigation. We're following the Chisholm Trail north. The trail is well marked by the bones of cattle from previous drives. As long as we follow the bones, we know we're on the right path. It's morbid, but effective. Getting lost could add weeks to the journey, exhausting the cattle and running out of supplies. It could also lead the herd into dangerous territory or away from water sources. Cowboys would scout ahead to confirm the route and look for landmarks. They'd ask other travelers for directions and information about the trail ahead. The chuck wagon cook often served as navigator since he traveled ahead of the herd to set up camp. He'd choose campsites near water and good grazing, and he'd mark the route for the herd to follow. All of these protection methods required coordination and discipline. A cattle drive was a military-style operation with clear hierarchy and roles. The trail boss was in command. The segundo, or second in command, would take over if the boss was injured or killed. The point riders, swing riders, flank riders, and drag riders each had specific responsibilities. Everyone had to work together. One cowboy making a mistake could endanger the entire operation. One cowboy falling asleep on guard duty could allow rustlers to steal cattle. One cowboy panicking during a stampede could get others killed. A trail boss's advice from 1876 emphasizes teamwork. A cattle drive is only as strong as its weakest man. I choose my crew carefully. I need men who can ride, shoot, and think. But most importantly, I need men who can work together. A crew that trusts each other can handle anything the trail throws at them. The payment for this dangerous work was modest. A typical cowboy earned about $1 a day or $30 a month. The trail boss might earn twice that. For months of brutal work and constant danger, the pay was barely enough to survive, but cowboys did it anyway. Some for the adventure, some because they had no other options, some because they loved the work despite the hardships. A cowboy's letter from 1880 reflects on the work. People ask me why I keep doing cattle drives. The pay is terrible, the work is brutal. I've been injured more times than I can count, but there's something about it. The freedom of the open range, the challenge of bringing a herd through against all odds, the brotherhood with the other cowboys. I can't explain it, but I can't give it up. The cattle drive era ended in the mid-1880s when railroads expanded and barbed wire fenced the open range. Cowboys no longer needed to drive cattle thousands of miles. They could load them on trains and ship them to market. But for those 20 years, cowboys developed protection methods that kept cattle drives moving despite incredible dangers. From turning stampedes to fighting rustlers, from crossing rivers to navigating by stars, these methods were the difference between success and disaster. The next time you see a cowboy movie, remember that the real work was even harder and more dangerous than Hollywood shows. These men protected valuable herds across hostile territory using nothing but skill, courage, and determination.